Hi, my name's Maya Whitus. I'm having some technical issues, so I'm recording this and posting it a bit wonky. I've made it on my laptop, and I've got it hooked up from my laptop, but I'm going to play it from my screen as I go through the presentation with you. So once again, my name's Maya Whitus. I am an art history major with a studio art minor, and today I'm going to go through with you on my presentation about female artists in antiquity. So as we get started, I'm just going to go through with a brief introduction. So we've already talked about quite a bit in class about the difference between traditional female versus male roles and households in antiquity. So females were a bit more domestic, they were more home-based, they were more subservient, as we've talked about, while men were more out there. They were seen as more stable, they were more capable of controlling their emotions, they were less impulsive, and so they were involved in a lot more things. Men could go out to the marketplace, they could engage in prostitution, they could talk about politics, they could really do whatever they wanted to do within reason, as long as they were still honoring their families. And then with art-wise, we've talked about the loom for women. Women are really well known for using the loom in antiquity. They would create the fabrics and the textiles they would use within their own houses on the loom. And it was required and expected by women to know how to use the loom and how to produce good materials from it. A good mythological story we get with the use of the loom in women is Odysseus. Odysseus's wife Penelope uses the loom as a distraction and a way to outsmart her foes. When Odysseus's opponents wait for her to marry him while he's gone, she instead uses the loom as an excuse and works in the loom tirelessly, but every night before she goes to bed, she undoes what she did the previous day. That way they can never force her to make a decision to marry them because she's busy working. And the fact that she was using the loom so much, so heavily, and they believed it was fully what she was doing and they took her for face value, shows just how important the loom was to the household and how much time a woman might allot to using the loom. So some of the things we're going to cover in our PowerPoint is evidence left over of women artists, some of the mediums that these artists might have worked in, and then examples of Greek female artists, and some questions you might want to consider for later discussion or that we could talk about at a later date is the obstacles women in antiquity might face towards becoming an artist that men would not, the obstacles a woman might face being remembered as an artist that men might not, and how might a woman become an artist. And then the three artworks I have here will go into a bit deeper throughout the presentation, but they are all created by women. And I'm sorry for the glare of my screen. I just truly don't know what else to do at this point. So we're going to start on mediums. So suspected mediums, we have pottery, ceramics. The creating of ceramics. We're going to talk specifically about Iron Age ceramics and the Diplon amphora, which is an example of an Iron Age ceramic. We're not really going to talk about looms and textiles. It's pretty much implied throughout because we already know that women were heavily into loom and textiles, but we'll apply it to the other mediums I'll talk about. And we'll talk about mosaics and paintings. So let's get started with evidence. So evidence is on the walls of Pompeii. So there's a building in Pompeii, they call it the House of the Surgeon. Now we don't know if a surgeon actually lived there, but we have found lots of artifacts and proof that there were surgeries and medical procedures performed there. So it's known as the House of the Surgeon. And in the House of the Surgeon, there are two paintings on the wall showing women painting from 50 to 79 CE. And then this next page, we'll look at these and compare these a bit bigger. So I know my screen's a bit shiny, but bear with me. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that I've circled each woman in the painting and their painting and the subject matter of the painting. So on the right, we have a woman, and it looks like she has painted a statue of Dionysus, which is up at the corner to the right, if you see it there. And we can see her maybe changing the color and getting to have some creative agency, but recreating that image. And then on the left, we have another woman painting, but we believe it's a portrait of the woman to her right. So already we have some kind of evidence that women were painters because we have a painter showing them painting. Now what's interesting about it is how idealized it is. We can see that these women were most likely women of high class and status because of their clothing and leisurely poses. So this leads us to the idea that women weren't, these women at least, weren't painting out of necessity. They weren't doing it to afford to live or to buy food. They were doing it as an intellectual activity in their free time. So already we get the possibility of women artists not just financially to support themselves, but women being artists is something to do to pass the time, much like they might use the loom to pass the time. So women who can afford the extra free time and afford the materials to paint might have painted just for the sake of painting. Another place of evidence that we have is writings. So one of the writers we have is Pliny the Elder, who wrote in the 1st century, and he wrote many books about history and art history. We'd call him an art historian, but they also tell us about multiple female painters, and one female painter is Leia, or Leia, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but he gives her quite a compliment. He says, "No one's hand was faster, and her artistic skill was such that, in prices she obtained, she far outdid the most celebrated painters of the same age, Sophocles and Dionysius." So that's quite a big compliment. He's basically saying not only is she good enough to hold her own, but she does better than men at the same time period. So we aren't going to find a lot of compliments like that, but they exist. So here's one of the ways we might find out about these female painters or artists of any kind. And it seems to be from the writings of men. Now, some of the issues we find with this is information gets lost. Maybe a document gets torn or misplaced, or only half of it or some of it. And so we lose very purposeful information that can really help us learn about these artists. There's also the possibility of men going and censoring the information. They might purposely leave out that an artist is female, or purposely leave out female artists as a whole to prevent any kind of idealization of women as artists. There's also the possibility of fake alias names. Maybe an artist who created a whole amount of work might have actually been a female using a male name. There's some possibility of that. And there's also the popularity of documents. If a book lists a bunch of female artists but it's not very popular, there aren't many copies of it, it's more likely to get lost. So those are also the potential issues we get from relying on writings, but writing is pretty much a pretty strong source of evidence that there were female artists in antiquity anyway. So now we're going to be looking at our argument. It's going to be women involved in ceramics. And this is from an article I found online arguing that women most likely were a strong contributors to the ceramics made in the Iron Age. So the argument goes that there are lots of land and few people, so women tend to be ceramics in this. And what I mean by this is, so typically in the Iron Age, it's pretty much just been accepted that the population went up during the Iron Age, but there's a bit of evidence suggesting the opposite, and that actually there was more land being secured but less people. And so typically when a society has less people but more land, people who may be marginalized normally are relied upon to create income and to create objects. So it's very, very likely that women were needed to be ceramicists more at this time. Now we're also going to be looking at the Difflon Amphora. So the Difflon Amphora is a very popular vase in antiquity, and it depicts women in funerals. So from this vase and several others, we can conclude that women had a very strong role in funerals. You could hire a mourner, basically, which would be a woman who would come up to the funeral and, following tradition, would act a bit hysterical at the funeral. And it was a way to honor that person, a way to make sure that person was getting the mourning and the amount of attention that they deserved. So women had a heavy part in funerals. And one of these things we've noticed is a lot of these Iron Age ceramics cover a lot of ground of funerals. It could be the ceremony, the person affected, the families, the tradition, the protocol, whatever. So one of the main questions during this article is, why would these ceramics be so deeply involved in something that takes such big space in the lives of women if they were created by men? So just subject-wise, there's the argument that these ceramics were actually made by women, and that's why we see funerals and something that was so heavily involved in women's livelihood in ceramics. And then also there's the geometric focus. You'll notice that in these pots they have lots of dashes and lines and geometric shapes, which is very different from the abstract shapes they had before. And the idea behind that is that the artists who were making the ceramics shifted from male to female. And we see a lot of these geometric shapes in textiles, specifically from the loom. So we get this idea that maybe females took over ceramics, and that's why the style and imagery of ceramics changed so drastically, because the people who were making it changed drastically. And now we're going to look at some examples of female artists. So this first one is an unnamed ceramicist. I don't know if you can read the text, and I won't read it word for word since there's so many points, but essentially in this island, they were going through a burial site and they found a body with unusual signs of wear. And it was like odd things, like the right side of her body was weaker, some of her bones were shinier, indicating more use. I think her muscles were a bit worn and torn, indicating that she'd been lifting and moving heavy things throughout her life. And while they were going through this burial site, they were actually around a master ceramicist. So this is somebody who creates a lot of ceramics, someone who maybe creates big scale ceramics consistently. And they found that her body had similar damage and wear and tear. And after doing the research and the analysis, they concluded that they did have the same wear and tears and that this woman must have been a master ceramicist, which makes a lot of sense about the tears in her body, but also the huge amount of ceramics they found by the burial site. So we don't have a specific name, but here we have an example of a specific woman ceramicist who lived in Antiquity. And then we have Ikaria. So we don't know a lot of specifics about her, but we know that she was a famous mosaic creator from Olynthus, and her most famous is this one right up here called Odysseus's Travel, and it talks about his travel home after the battle of Troy, well, the War of Troy. And so it's very famous. We get this idea of a narrative story, which is very popular in Greek art. It is from 350 BC, it is shown in the British Museum, and it's 5 by 9 feet, so not very big, excuse me. And as I said, it's an example of some narrative art. Now, the other two mosaics at the bottom are also hers, and for those who don't know, a mosaic is a painting composed of a bunch of tiny stones. They probably would take the stones, collect them, sort them by size, paint them, sort them by color and size, and then create the image. So a lot of time and thought goes into a mosaic. So we have a female mosaic artist. And then the last specific artist we'll be talking today, because we're already running a bit short in time, is going to be Helena of Egypt. Now, we don't have a lot of details about her besides the fact that she was written by Photius. But we do know she's from around 300 BCE, and that she was a battle and narrative painter. And based off what I'll be talking about quite shortly, there is some slight evidence that it could have potentially been used for political gain. So Photius, who was a Constantinople writer in the 19th century, tells about her painting being used politically in his book Bibliotheca, which is an encyclopedia, when he said that Helena painted the Battle of Issos. So Issos was a very famous battle between Alexander the Great and somebody else. It happened along Turkey, and he won, but it was a very hardly fought battle. And so there would have been a need to spread the news, to spread the joy, get the word out that Alexander is the man, right? So she gets commissioned by Ptolemy I, who's the regent king of Egypt at the time and was also one of his closest lieutenants and participated in the battle. And he hires her and commissions her to make this painter of this scene. And so people who did not get the news or could not have seen how it went down were having it painted for them and shown to them. So we get the idea of art being used politically, although we don't know specifically how it was used and who interpreted it. It's just something we can assume and speculate about. And then I can't find the actual painting, but this mosaic was made shortly after, and we believe it was heavily influenced by her painting. So I'll kind of zoom in here. All right. And then that actually concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. But today we talked about different female artists in antiquity, different mediums they might have used, different reasons why they might have created the art, whether it was free time or it was for money. And we talked about some specific examples of female artists in antiquity. Thank you.